A word or two about the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. We are a private operating foundation and think tank in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We take a particular interest in tax policy and urban planning. I deal with the urban planning side of things. And I will tell you a little bit about specific products of ours and lines of work as I go through this talk. Anthony Flint, our Director of Public Affairs, is here with me and will be a resource for you during the rest of the day as you may want to learn more about what we do. Speaking of third act surprises, this is as long as I've been away from a PowerPoint presentation that I submitted over a week ago without looking back, and I don't have a copy of it. So, surprise. 103 million new American city dwellers by the year 2050. So it's kind of interesting as we look at this urban age that by mid-century, according to UN projections, there are going to be about 500 million new Indian city dwellers. There are going to be about 300 million new Chinese city dwellers. They're going to be on the order of 200 million new city dwellers in Nigeria. But in the United States, we're on the list. We're number 4 with over 100 million new urban Americans. Where are they going to live? A few years ago, Bob Yarrow, who teaches at the University of Pennsylvania, as well as being president of Regional Plan Association, and I were doing an urban planning studio at the University of Pennsylvania. And we looked out to mid-century, somewhat boldly thinking in big terms about time and space, more so than most plans of the past. And students, using some simple projections, discovered that, wow, not everybody is going to be living in the same places they were living before. Some places are significantly losing population. Some are significantly gaining. This is going to create tremendous stresses as well as tremendous opportunities. But it really means that we're building a new country over the next half century. And we have to think hard now about how we're going to do that. Another thing that affects all this, when we think about the world and we think about the United States, is reflected in a recent publication by the Lincoln Institute, a book called Planet of Cities by Shlomo Sali Angel. Planet of Cities is about the discovery through a very systematic analysis of cities around the world over a very long period of time that cities are almost universally getting less dense, that new development, incremental development, is occupying a larger footprint than historical development. This means that, in particular, in the countries that I've mentioned, we're going to see a tremendous consumption of land, a tremendous impact on resources, and in terms of things like greenhouse gas emissions, which many of you have been concerned about over the last day here, a potential increase in greenhouse gas emissions due to transportation. This is a great concern to us, and we have been motivated by this to think about planning tools that can help us think over time and space, longer periods of time, bigger spaces. We see the United States, for example, organized in mega regions that are made up of multiple metropolitan areas, expanding across 500 miles or more. This is a very big challenge. In terms of greenhouse gas emissions, it's possible to model these. It's possible to look at how different development patterns will affect climate change. This has been done in a number of cases, but it's a graphic tool that helps us to see if we're choosing a development path, will it help us meet our targets or not? It's also possible, and here we are back in California with the Sacramento Regional Blueprint Plan, to think about planning at very large scales. California has been doing this systematically pretty much across the board. I think increasingly we're going to see this in American mega regions and large metropolitan areas. Well, we got into this tools development in a very particular way. We do a fair amount of work in the American West. We actually have an office in Phoenix, Arizona. We became interested in a potential demonstration of some planning techniques as well as tool development in an area called Superstition Vistas. And this is a very large area of desert. It's about 200 square miles. It's on the east side of Phoenix. It's in the direct path of future urbanization. And it is made up of state trust land, which is held by the public with the intention of developing it or otherwise using it to raise revenue to pay for schools in Arizona. So it's a school trust land parcel, happens to be a very large one. And the thought was that thinking ahead, and this could even be a 100-year plan, depending on how long it takes to build, that there are a lot of different ways that one could approach thinking about this particular future. And in order to do this project, we really had two components of the, which really represent 2 out of 3 of the things I want to talk to you about today. We had a tools development component. We had a planning process that was in some ways innovative, in some ways replicating some successful plans of the past. And we really started what will become the third topic, and that is we started to develop the network of developers of software, planners, and users of software that is sort of the ultimate product of this whole exercise. But thinking about Superstition Vistas, we brought together a group of stakeholders. So it's kind of a tough place to plan because it's uninhabited. And so the stakeholders don't live in the place yet. They're future stakeholders. So we really needed proxies or representatives of those future stakeholders, and a lot of these were public officials and citizens from the surrounding areas in the inhabited areas of the counties around this fairly barren area. And one of the principles, of course, and it would make sense to any planner, in approaching this is to think some of this land should never be built on. And it was very obvious where the biologically important land was, and there was a considerable amount of it, and this needed to be reserved as habitat, and indeed it fits in with other protected land as a very important landscape, and that went without saying. But there was still a tremendous area that was suitable for development, did not present significant environmental constraints, could be developed essentially on every square inch. But that would have certain consequences. So scenarios were developed to test the outcomes of different development patterns. And our contribution in particular was to develop 2 modules that would look specifically at greenhouse gas emissions and at water consumption, 2 of the most important environmental considerations in planning in a place like Arizona, to see if we could do better. Now, when it comes to the process of scenario planning, there are really 2 essential approaches that we've seen used in the world. The most common approach, and in fact, in a sense, the approach we started with, although we modified it, is to say, let's look at the trends. Let's find some way to graphically depict where things are heading and show people as realistically as possible what a place might look like in the future. So our sort of typical scenario A would be a reflection of business as usual practices. And very often this is not a very pretty picture. And most people react to it, especially as it accumulates over years and years, in a fairly negative way. It's, oh, we really don't like that future. We'd like something else. And then one often sees a kind of ramped up sort of super environmental, highly efficient, very different kind of future, which would be kind of a plan B, that is so desirable, but then you start to price it and you discover that, these great things come with a cost, and they're politically difficult, and we have to change all the rules. And then very often what's discovered is that one can dial back just a bit and discover somewhere between the awful future of business as usual and this sort of idealized future world that seems almost impossibly difficult, something that's achievable, that's a lot better, not quite as good as the ideal, that's a lot better. And this starts to mobilize public support for change and for improvement. Well, that sounds okay, and it certainly, I think, is a fair description of successful planning projects like Envision Utah, which indeed was the kind of model for this approach. Robert Groh, who led Envision Utah, actually was the consultant in charge of the scenario planning process. John Fregonese was the consultant in charge of the model building, and he had worked to build the Envision modeling tool that was used in Utah very successfully. So we were essentially moving to replicate that approach. But what concerned us was, if we really care about climate change and we're really worried about water management in a place like Arizona, is something better than business as usual and not quite ideal really good enough? And should we not be pushing harder to see if we can't do what is necessary as opposed to what is convenient? And so you see here just a representation of a scenario D, which is actually based on meeting greenhouse gas targets. And what it amounts to is very obvious, I think, is a sort of super concentration of the development in a handful of nodes, which is far different than the typical development pattern that we've seen in Phoenix, and it certainly doesn't represent the current real estate model. But interestingly enough, and odd as it might seem to folks from that part of the world, Phoenix itself is starting to remake itself in much more of this pattern, and now with light rail investment and some concentration of new development in the downtown area, we see a place that could almost be converging in its development style with this kind of far-out way of thinking. Well, a lot came out of this exercise, and by the way, it occurred just as the real estate market collapsed, and the thought that this land is going to be developed anytime soon seems unrealistic. So more time for people to think about how serious we're going to be about greenhouse gas emissions and how concerned we are about water. So time is actually good in this case. But one thing we learned was that the modeling tools that we were using and our development of these two new modules on the Envision model were not going to get as wide use as one would like, because it's a proprietary model. You have to buy it, it's expensive, or you have to go to one consulting firm which can execute the simulations for you. It's a very nice tool, but we became concerned with the idea that this is a kind of closed source approach. And out of thinking about this, we put together a policy focus report, and there are a number of copies of this available on the bar. It's also available as a free PDF download on our website, as are all of our policy focus reports at the Lincoln Institute. But this is really an examination of the field of tools that have been used to support scenario planning, thinking about the future, and it reaches certain conclusions. I'll get into that in a second, but as we say, the third act surprises here. I forgot about this slide, but this is a product of Regional Plan Association, and it shows a little bit of the kind of future that one might want. This is mapping a world of high-speed rail with dense hubs. It's a view of the northeast of the United States where a regional plan works. And what it's showing is a kind of alternative outcome to business as usual that I think many would say is desirable, but will take considerable change. And here is just another example of the kind of sketch planning that comes out of the Envision tool, a more ground level version of what, in this case, Superstition Vistas could actually look like, which is, again, quite different than the standard development model. Well, let me talk about tools a bit. And I can't see you all very well, but how many have engaged in this sort of exercise with Legos or little chips or some others? A number of you know what this is about. And ULI, of course, has done a number of these around the country, and I've been through a number of them myself. This is a sort of an interesting way to get people engaged in looking at the problem of allocating population across space. So Essentially, the exercise is based on being given a certain amount of population growth within an area, region, metropolitan area usually, and the thought is that population has to go somewhere, and it is either going to spread out and cause a lot of sprawl, or it's going to get stacked up into some kind of density and conserve a lot of land. This is a fairly simple principle, but as it turns out, it's not a principle that most people seem to understand very well until they go through an exercise like this, where they discover that indeed they have to do something with the people. They have to live somewhere, and density comes out as a solution. At the Lincoln Institute, we've been very interested in this whole idea of density and how to make it more acceptable to people, how to make it work better. But obviously, a building block tool is a kind of a limited way of thinking about the future, and it only really deals with this one dimension. It's an important lesson, but we think one can go further. And the tools are evolving in such a way that one can use these interactive sketch tablets, and ultimately we'll get to mobile devices, I'll show you in a second, that are obviously much more robust in terms of being able to bring together many more people over much larger spaces. They don't all have to be in the same place. And not only is this kind of a device and this kind of approach useful in terms of thinking about the future, it can actually be used in real time in permit systems. We had a presentation just a couple days ago by the city planning directors from around the country back in Cambridge. And Dallas presented their new electronic permitting system. They charge $1,000 an hour to have access to this. It's extremely popular. I think they're now doing something like 40% of their permits on an express lane. But what it amounts to is that people don't have to be in the same room. They just have to tune in, and they're able to interact and communicate across building plans and end up with a permit. So there's a sort of urban management real-time aspect, but also this sort of very futuristic, long-range way of thinking about planning. Let me talk about a different kind of scenario planning. So the preferred futures approach, which is the Envision Utah model, has been used around the country since that successful experiment, is based on an assumption that people can identify an agreeable future, a desirable future, that they can reach a consensus about it through an interactive process, that they can describe it well, and that all one has to do then is make certain plans and change certain policies, and they'll get that future. I think there's a problem with that. The problem is uncertainty. We actually don't know today what conditions are going to apply in 2050 in a number of important areas. The one that is probably most troubling today is climate change. We really don't know how much the planet is going to warm. We really don't know exactly how much the sea is going to rise, and that's just in a generic sense. In terms of any specific location, we know far less. The uncertainty is very high. So an approach to the future that's based on accepting uncertainty instead of denying it, and in effect saying there are a range of possibilities. The sea could rise so much. It could be so many degrees hotter. There are many plausible futures that we need to be prepared to address, and build this into the scenario planning so that the scenarios are actually based on what may not be desirable futures, but futures that we conceivably will need to contend with. And then we can adopt strategies that are robust across a range of possible futures, and that will permit us to have few regrets, if not no regrets, about our decisions. So as technology continues to develop, and the last thing I wanted to mention is a network of software developers and software users and planners, and we're encouraging that network to continue to operate, and we're sure we'll see apps. I know there already are some terrific apps on mobile devices and so forth. I think it's worth keeping in mind this more philosophical aspect of scenario planning, which really goes back to its origins in Royal Dutch Shell, thinking hard about future markets, which they did very, very beneficially. Seeing the phone, or the whatever it is, BlackBerry, reminds me of, on two occasions, just last night and the night before, walking around with Tom Wright, trying to find a restaurant, looking down at our iPhones and saying it's there, and only to look up and discover we're standing right in front. So I think the lesson for all of you is look up from your devices now and then, because the future might be staring you in the face.
So we have time for Armando for a question. So this will be the lead-in to the questions that you're going to get in coffee. Coffee is a good lubricant for questions and answers, but you're going to get that in just a moment or two.
Okay.
So I'm going to actually call on Arun, the former city planner of Portland, to maybe give us, a Portland perspective. Not that you're speaking on behalf of the whole city, mind you. But can you say the applicability to what Portland is facing right now, if you look at the interactive planning and public participation perspective on this? Just a few comments.
Oh, well. Thank you. I was not expecting a question in this way. But thanks. Well, actually, what Armando's talking about is absolutely correct. And I highly sort of worry about the same sort of issues, and Portland is a good example about saying, if you didn't know anything about the future, what kind of city would you want anyway? And this is a very different approach to dealing with uncertainty than the predictive model itself. Now, the idea of the predictive model is both exciting, but it's also limited in the sense that we can't model everything. It just gives us an indication. And just to talk about the model from a personal perspective, I think the issue is the problem is not a model. The problem is not the developer of the model. The problem is the lay consumer of the output of the model. And so when we have politicians or we have other city planning officials looking at growth populations or climate change or air quality monitoring or traffic monitoring, the idea is how clever can we be at the administrative level to be able to interpret the meaning of the output and use it in a more appropriate way. And I think the work that you're doing and illustrating actually sort of gets to that particular dimension of saying, well, the model is useful here, but your analogy of just looking up sometimes is really appropriate. And I think Portland works in that direction, but I think it also needs to, it's part of the overall sort of milieu of problems.
Yeah, I'll say a thing about Portland. We've studied Portland a bit. We made a documentary film about Portland, and I actually was engaged in a review of the state land use system, which brought me out there a year ago to look around pretty carefully. And I was impressed that there is a famous urban growth boundary around Portland, which sort of suggests all development's going to be here, and all farms are going to be there, and forests. And it's a simple and strong image. But that doesn't actually tell you where development is going to go over a 50-year period. And they've actually created a 50-year plan and reached some consensus around it that says not where every single house will go, but where the urban reserves will be, where the farm reserves will be, in a much more specific way, but still accounting for this sort of unpredictability at the precise location. And I think that's a little bit of the tension of this kind of planning. It's like quantum physics. Things are moving around. You can't say exactly where they're going to be, but you can start to identify generally what the energy levels are and so forth. And I think it's very difficult for most planners who are trained in physical planning to not think about things in extremely concrete and specific terms. And unfortunately, the future cannot really be conceived of in that way effectively.
The answer to the question is the next city a wave or a particle?
Exactly. Schrodinger's cat.
10:45 will come back after your coffee.
Thank
Thanks
you
so much.